The bitter winter wind over German-occupied Europe howled through the torn fuselage of a dying bomber. The aircraft, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress nicknamed All-American, was never meant to still be in the air. Its right tail section was almost completely severed, dangling by a few scraps of metal and control cables. Its skin was shredded, the once sleek body now a patchwork of gaping holes and twisted steel. Engines coughed and sputtered, black smoke trailing behind them as if marking the bomber's funeral procession across the sky. And yet, impossibly, it flew. Inside the battered giant, 10 men fought not just the enemy, but death itself. Blood smeared the aluminum floor where a waist gunner had fallen. The bitter smell of cordite mixed with leaking hydraulic fluid. Through the holes in the fuselage, the freezing air blasted their faces, numbing fingers that clutched at control yokes and machine gun handles. They had been ambushed by waves of German fighters and ripped apart by relentless flak. Radio contact was gone, instruments were failing, and yet despite everything, the All-American refused to die. This is not a work of fiction. This is one of the most extraordinary true stories of World War II aviation, a story of iron, courage, and the unbreakable will of a crew who simply would not give up. And as we follow their journey from a routine bombing mission to one of the most miraculous returns in aviation history, we uncover the legend of the Flying Fortress, the plane that brought its men home against impossible odds. When Boeing first designed the B-17 in the 1930s, they envisioned a bomber that could deliver a heavy payload deep into enemy territory, withstand punishment, and still make it home. The result was an aircraft unlike anything that had come before it. With 4 massive Wright Cyclone radial engines, a wingspan of over 100 feet, and a range exceeding 2,000 miles, the B-17 was built for endurance. Its multiple .50 caliber machine guns, housed in nose, tail, dorsal, belly, and waist positions, turned it into a flying fortress, bristling with defensive firepower. And perhaps most importantly, its rugged airframe and redundant systems gave it a reputation for toughness that became legendary among bomber crews. Pilots loved the B-17 because it could take hits that would bring other planes down and still keep flying. Ground crews often marveled at aircraft that limped home with wings full of holes, engines barely clinging to life, or tails half torn away. But even among these tales of survival, one mission in particular would come to symbolize the very essence of the Flying Fortress spirit. On February 1, 1943, the 414th Bomb Squadron of the 97th Bomb Group took off from their base in North Africa on a mission to bomb German-controlled shipping yards in Tunisia. Among them was a relatively new B-17, serial number 41-24485, known simply as All-American. The crew was experienced and disciplined, and though the mission was dangerous, as all daylight bombing runs were, nothing about it seemed unusual. They were part of a larger formation tasked with striking a key logistics hub, crippling the enemy's ability to supply its forces in North Africa. But as the bombers neared their target, the sky erupted in chaos. German flak batteries opened up from the ground, black puffs of shrapnel-filled clouds bursting all around the formation. The All-American was buffeted and rocked as explosions tore through the air. One shell exploded dangerously close, sending fragments ripping through the bomber's aluminum skin. But the real danger was yet to come. As the formation turned for the long flight home, Luftwaffe fighters pounced. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s dove from above and below, their cannons and machine guns spitting fire into the bombers. The All-American fired back with every gun it had. Waist gunners raked the sky with streams of tracers, while the top turret and tail gunner tried desperately to ward off the incoming attackers. The air was a deadly dance of fire and steel. In the midst of the melee, one German fighter made a final desperate attack. It was heavily damaged, trailing smoke, but the pilot aimed straight for the All-American's tail. At the last second, he lost control and collided directly with the B-17's rear fuselage. The impact was catastrophic. The enemy fighter disintegrated, but its wreckage sliced through the All-American's tail section like a blade. The bomber lurched violently, alarms screamed. The crew felt the entire aircraft shudder as if it had been struck by a hammer. When the dust and smoke cleared, the crew stared in horror. The All-American's tail section, everything behind the rear waist gun positions, was almost completely severed. Only a few twisted metal spars and control cables held it together. It swayed and flapped in the slipstream, threatening to tear free at any moment. If it did, the bomber would lose all control and tumble into the earth. The crew's situation was now desperate. The tail gunner miraculously survived the collision, though he was trapped amid the wreckage. Other crew members rushed to his aid, crawling over jagged metal and open voids where the bomber's skin had once been. Wind screamed through the fuselage. Every vibration, every gust threatened to finish the job the German fighter had started. And yet, the All-American was still flying. Barely. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, faced an impossible choice. They were deep in enemy territory, their radio was damaged, and the bomber's controls were sluggish and unresponsive. Bailing out might mean capture or death. Staying aboard meant trying to coax a crippled aircraft across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. But Bragg and his crew were determined. They decided to stay with their ship. What followed was a feat of airmanship and teamwork that would become the stuff of legend. The crew improvised solutions to problems that should have been fatal. They used parachutes, clothing, and anything they could find to plug holes and reinforce damaged areas. They redistributed weight to stabilize the aircraft and carefully adjusted engine power to maintain balance. Every mile flown was a gamble. The tail could shear off at any second, taking the bomber and everyone aboard with it. But inch by inch, mile by mile, they pressed on. Other bombers in the formation were astonished. Many expected the All-American to fall apart in mid-air. But when they realized she was still flying, they closed ranks around her, offering protection from further fighter attacks. It was a silent salute to a crew and a machine that refused to surrender. Hours later, with fuel running low and every nerve stretched to breaking point, the All-American finally reached friendly airspace. The landing would be its final test. With its tail hanging by threads, the aircraft was barely controllable. The crew prepared for the worst, bracing themselves for a crash they might not survive. The airfield stretched out before them like a distant promise, shimmering in the afternoon haze. They were so close now, yet still disaster loomed. The tail section of the All-American swayed violently with every shift in air pressure, and the rudder barely responded. The elevator controls, essential for controlling the bomber's pitch during landing, were almost completely gone. Lieutenant Bragg knew that even the smallest mistake could tear the crippled aircraft apart in the final moments. But turning back was not an option. They had come too far. They had survived too much. Now, they would finish this mission together. The crew prepared for impact. Parachutes were repurposed as makeshift harnesses, tied around structural beams to keep men from being thrown forward on landing. Ammunition, tools, and other loose items were secured or thrown overboard to lighten the load. The radio operator, working with a set that barely functioned, sent one final message to the base. Severely damaged, attempting landing. It was all they could manage. Ground crews scrambled to clear the runway, fire trucks and ambulances lining up at the edges in grim anticipation. As the All-American approached the airfield, every man aboard held his breath. Bragg feathered the remaining engines, carefully reducing power while fighting to keep the bomber level. The control yoke felt heavy and sluggish, responding with agonizing delay. Too much pressure and the tail might snap off. Too little and the bomber would stall and fall from the sky. There was no room for error. The ground rushed closer, wheels down, flaps extended. It was now or never. The All-American touched down harder than any of them hoped. The impact sent a shudder through the fuselage, and for a split second, it seemed the tail might finally tear free. Metal groaned and rivets popped under the stress. But somehow, miraculously, the bomber stayed intact. It rolled down the runway, skidding slightly, sparks flying from damaged landing gear. And then, at last, it slowed to a stop. The impossible had happened. The plane that by all rights should have fallen from the sky had returned home. When the ground crews reached the bomber, they were stunned. It was a miracle that it had landed at all. The tail was hanging on by little more than twisted metal and luck. Jagged holes pockmarked the fuselage, some large enough for a man to crawl through. Hydraulic lines were severed, control cables frayed, and one engine was completely dead. Yet, despite the devastation, the All-American had delivered her crew safely back to base. Not one man had been lost. News of the mission spread quickly. Within days, photographs of the All-American's mangled tail section appeared in newspapers and military briefings around the world. To the Allied forces, the image became a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope. If a plane so utterly destroyed could still bring its men home, then perhaps victory itself was not as distant as it seemed. For the crew, it was a story they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a testament to their training, their teamwork, and the extraordinary strength of the flying fortress. The all-American story was far from unique. It was one of many accounts that illustrated the legendary toughness of the B-17. Time and again, these bombers returned home against impossible odds. One aircraft came back with its nose completely blown off, the wind roaring through the cockpit as the pilot and co-pilot flew exposed to the freezing air. Another landed with 3 engines dead and the 4th sputtering its last breaths. There were bombers that flew hundreds of miles with their wings shredded, others that returned missing entire sections of fuselage. The B-17 was not just a machine, it was a lifeline. What made the Flying Fortress so resilient? The answer lay in its design philosophy. Boeing engineers had anticipated that the B-17 would face heavy resistance over enemy territory, so they built it with redundancy in mind. Critical systems were duplicated or triplicated. Control cables were routed along multiple paths so that if one was severed, another could still function. The wings were designed to withstand tremendous stress, and the fuselage was reinforced with internal bracing that could hold together even after sustaining catastrophic damage. It was an aircraft designed to endure punishment, and then some. But engineering alone was not enough. The courage and ingenuity of the crews who flew these machines were just as vital to their survival. Training for B-17 crews was intense and relentless. Pilots learned to manage engine failures, navigate without instruments, and even fly with portions of their control surfaces missing. Gunners drilled endlessly on defensive tactics, coordinating their fire to repel enemy fighters. Each crew member had to know not just his own job, but how to assist others if the situation demanded it. And when disaster struck, as it often did, that training made all the difference. There were countless moments during the All-Americans flight when panic could have taken hold. When the tail was nearly severed, they could have bailed out. When the controls became unresponsive, they could have surrendered to despair. But they didn't. They adapted. They improvised. They trusted one another. And that trust, forged in the skies above Europe, turned a hopeless situation into a miracle. The psychological impact of these stories on the Allied war effort cannot be overstated. Bomber crews faced staggering casualty rates. In some units, losses reached nearly 50%. Every mission was a gamble, and many men never returned. Yet tales of bombers like the All-American boosted morale in a way few things could. They reminded airmen that even when everything went wrong, survival was still possible. They reminded the home front that American technology and determination were forces to be reckoned with. And they reminded the enemy that no amount of firepower could break the spirit of those who fought back. In the months that followed, the B-17 continued to prove its worth over the skies of Europe. Massive daylight raids struck deep into Nazi-held territory, targeting factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. Losses remained high, but the missions crippled Germany's ability to sustain the war. And each time a battered bomber limped home, engines sputtering, wings riddled with holes, crew exhausted but alive, it reinforced the legend of the Flying Fortress. For the men of the All-American, their mission was over, but the memory would never fade. They became minor celebrities within the 97th Bomb Group, often retelling the story of their miraculous return to new crews just arriving from training. Their bomber, too, became a symbol of hope. Though too badly damaged to fly again in combat, it was salvaged for parts, its sacrifice ensuring that other flying fortresses could continue the fight. In a way, the All-American never truly died. Pieces of her flew again, carried into battle by other aircraft, protecting new crews as they embarked on their own dangerous missions. It was fitting, perhaps, that the All-American's final legacy was not destruction, but endurance. Just as the plane had refused to fall from the sky, so too did the ideals it represented: courage, perseverance, and unbreakable resolve. Those qualities became the hallmark of the American bomber force and, in many ways, the defining spirit of the Allied war effort. And even now, decades later, the story of that shattered B-17 limping home through enemy skies continues to inspire all who hear it. The legend of the All-American quickly spread beyond the airfields of North Africa. Across Allied bases in Britain, Italy, and the Mediterranean, bomber crews passed the story along in hushed conversations before missions and over-weary drinks after returning from raids. It was more than just a tale of survival. It was proof that the Flying Fortress was living up to its name. And it wasn't long before other stories, equally astonishing, began to surface. Each one added a new chapter to the growing mythology of the B-17, a mythology that would outlast the war itself. One such story belonged to a bomber named WOULDN, a B-17 from the 379th Bomb Group based in England. On December 20th, 1943, it was part of a mission to bomb a Focke-Wulf aircraft production facility in Bremen, Germany. The raid was supposed to be routine as flying through flak-filled skies over the heart of the Reich could ever be. But before long, things went terribly wrong. Heavy anti-aircraft fire struck the bomber formation, and Ye Olde Pub was hit hard. Shell fragments tore through its nose, shattering the oxygen system and wounding several crew members. One engine was knocked out completely, and another sputtered dangerously. As the formation pressed deeper into Germany, fighters attacked. A swarm of Bf-109s and FW-190s descended on the crippled bomber, hammering it with cannon fire. The tail gunner was killed, the top turret gunner wounded, and the plane's defensive guns fell silent one by one as ammunition ran out. Holes gaped in the fuselage. Control cables were severed. The bomber slipped out of formation, falling behind and alone, an easy target for the Luftwaffe. Yet even as flames licked at the engines and blood stained the floor, the crew refused to give up. Pilot Charles "Charlie" Brown fought to keep the aircraft level, coaxing power from the remaining engines and struggling against damaged controls. Somehow, miraculously, the B-17 remained airborne. It was then, as the bomber limped toward the North Sea, that one of the most extraordinary encounters of the war took place. Franz Stigler, a German fighter ace with over 20 victories, spotted the shattered B-17 struggling to escape. He climbed his Messerschmitt into position and prepared to deliver the final blow. But as he closed in, something stopped him. Through the holes in the bomber's fuselage, he could see the wounded crew tending to one another. He saw their faces, not as enemies, but as men fighting for their lives. Stigler later said that shooting them down would have been like shooting at a man in a parachute. Instead of opening fire, he pulled alongside the crippled bomber and motioned for the crew to follow him. Confused and wary, Brown kept flying. Stigler escorted the B-17 out of German airspace, saluting the American crew before peeling away and returning to his base. Ye Olde Pub somehow made it back to England, barely managing a landing. The encounter remained a secret for decades, but when Brown and Stigler finally met again in the 1990s, they became close friends, a testament to the humanity that sometimes transcended the brutality of war. Their story, like that of the All-American, was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, resilience and honor could still prevail. These stories weren't isolated miracles. They were part of a larger pattern that defined the B-17's reputation. In another instance, a bomber returned to base with its nose section completely blown off by flak. The pilot and co-pilot, exposed to the freezing slipstream, flew hundreds of miles back to safety without a windshield or cockpit enclosure. Another B-17 landed with one wing nearly severed, its internal spars barely holding the structure together. Some bombers came home with their bomb bays empty, not because they had dropped their payloads, but because the entire section had been ripped away in combat. Time and again, the Flying Fortress defied the odds. The reason for this resilience was as much psychological as it was mechanical. The crews who flew these bombers came to trust them like old friends. They knew that even when everything seemed lost, the B-17 might still carry them home. That faith gave them the courage to push forward into missions that, by any rational measure, seemed suicidal. It was said among bomber crews that if they had to go into hell itself, they'd want to do it in a flying fortress. But the war was far from forgiving. Every mission was a brutal test of endurance. German flak was precise and deadly, and Luftwaffe fighters showed no mercy. Casualty rates among bomber crews were among the highest of any branch of the U.S. military. It was not uncommon for a crew to complete just a handful of missions before being shot down. The U.S. 8th Air Force, which conducted the daylight bombing campaigns over Europe, suffered over 26,000 deaths, more than the entire Marine Corps during the war. The men who climbed aboard those bombers each morning knew the odds were against them, and yet they climbed aboard anyway. For many crews, the bond between man and machine was deeply personal. Pilots gave their bombers names and painted them with elaborate nose art, symbols of home, luck, or loved ones waiting for them. These names, Memphis Belle, Shoo Shoo Baby, 909, the Swoos, became legends in their own right, each with stories of harrowing missions and miraculous returns. When a bomber was lost, it was mourned almost like a fallen comrade. And when one returned home battered and broken but still intact, it was celebrated as a triumph over the impossible. The story of the Memphis Belle is a perfect example. As one of the first B-17s to complete 25 missions and return home with its crew alive, the Memphis Belle became a symbol of hope and perseverance. Its successful campaign was widely publicized back in the United States, boosting morale on the home front and proving that survival was possible even amid the slaughter. The aircraft and its crew embarked on a war bond tour across America, inspiring countless civilians and servicemen alike. Today, the Memphis Belle is preserved in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, a living monument to the courage of those who flew her. What united all these stories, the All-American, Yo Old Pub, the Memphis Belle, and countless others, was a shared thread of determination. These were not tales of machines acting alone. They were stories of ordinary men who, when faced with overwhelming odds, found the strength to fight on. They were stories of teamwork, improvisation, and unwavering trust. And above all, they were stories of belief that the Flying Fortress would not let them down. Back on the airfields of England, Italy, and North Africa, crews prepared for their next missions. The ground crews patched up holes, replaced engines, and repaired torn fuselages. Pilots studied new tactics and routes. Gunners cleaned their weapons and counted their ammunition. They all knew what lay ahead: more flak, more fighters, more death. But they also knew something else, that no matter how badly their bombers were hit, there was always a chance they could make it home. And that knowledge, that sliver of hope, was often the difference between despair and survival. As the air war over Europe intensified in 1943 and 1944, the B-17 Flying Fortress became more than just a weapon. It was the very embodiment of Allied strategy. The United States and Britain had agreed on a policy of strategic bombing, a campaign designed to cripple Germany's industrial heart and break its capacity to wage war. While the Royal Air Force conducted nighttime raids to reduce losses, the U.S. Army Air Forces flew by day, believing that precision bombing of factories, transportation hubs, and oil refineries could hasten the Nazi regime's collapse. This approach was risky and deadly. Daylight missions meant flying straight into the teeth of German defenses. And yet, it was the B-17 that made it possible. Flying in tight formations called combat boxes, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of flying fortresses would thunder across the sky in vast waves, their engines shaking the air as they headed deep into enemy territory. Each bomber carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and was bristling with up to 1350 caliber machine guns. Together, they formed a self-defending wall of fire, able to lay down a curtain of bullets against incoming fighters. Even so, the Luftwaffe adapted quickly, launching coordinated attacks that pushed bomber crews to their limits. It was not uncommon for a mission to last 8 or more hours, with 2 or 3 hours spent under relentless attack. The statistics paint a grim picture. On the infamous mission to Schweinfurt-Regensburg in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s in a single day. Over 600 men killed, captured, or missing. Other missions saw similar devastation. But the bombing campaign continued, and with each mission, crews learned, adapted, and improved. Fighter escorts such as the long-range P-51 Mustang eventually reduced losses dramatically, but until then, it was often just the bomber crews themselves standing between success and annihilation. What kept them going was a sense of purpose and the stories that circulated among them. Tales of aircraft like the All-American were retold again and again, serving as reminders that even when the odds were terrible, survival was possible. These stories spread beyond the bomber bases, too. Newspapers back home carried dramatic photos of battered B-17s and headlines celebrating their miraculous returns. Civilians who read about these missions were awestruck by the bravery of the crews and inspired by the resilience of the machines they flew. The Flying Fortress became a symbol of American resolve, a mechanical representation of a nation that refused to surrender. The German military, for its part, quickly learned to fear the B-17. It wasn't just the destruction these bombers unleashed on factories, railways, and oil refineries. It was their ability to keep coming, no matter how many were shot down. German civilians described the formations as flying cities that blotted out the sky. Anti-aircraft crews grew frustrated as waves of B-17s continued to pour over their defenses, even after suffering horrendous losses. And Luftwaffe pilots, while often successful in downing bombers, came to respect the sheer toughness of the Flying Fortress, a plane that often remained airborne even after sustaining damage that would destroy almost any other aircraft. One Luftwaffe ace interviewed after the war admitted that he had seen a B-17 continue flying with half a wing missing, trailing smoke and fire long after he believed it should have fallen. "We could not understand how they stayed in the air," he said. "It was like fighting against ghosts." This psychological effect, the belief that the Americans would keep coming no matter what, played a crucial role in breaking German morale on the ground and in the air. And yet, behind the heroism and the mythology lay a grim reality. The toll on bomber crews was devastating. The average crewman had a life expectancy of just 15 missions in the early years of the war. Entire squadrons were wiped out on single raids. Survivors often returned to their bases with haunted eyes, carrying the memories of friends who had not made it back. The camaraderie among these men was deep and unshakable, forged in the shared knowledge that every mission could be their last. They celebrated every successful return, no matter how battered their aircraft, and mourned every empty bunk in the barracks. The bond extended beyond the crews to the machines themselves. Pilots often spoke about their bombers as if they were living beings, comrades who shared in their fate. Many wrote farewell messages on the fuselage when an aircraft was finally too damaged to repair, treating it almost like a fallen friend. In turn, crews believed that their planes had personalities. Some were lucky, always finding a way home. Others were fighters, enduring punishment that should have destroyed them. And then there were the rare few, like the All-American, that seemed almost supernatural, refusing to die no matter how much damage they took. As the war dragged into its final years, the cumulative impact of the strategic bombing campaign became undeniable. German industry was crippled, oil production plummeted, transportation networks collapsed, and the Luftwaffe was bled dry in its desperate attempts to stop the bomber streams. By 1944, the Allies had gained air superiority over Europe, paving the way for the D-Day invasion and the liberation of occupied territories. The B-17 was instrumental in this shift. It had not only delivered destruction to the heart of Nazi Germany, but had also tied down vast numbers of enemy aircraft and resources that might otherwise have been used against Allied ground forces. Even after the war ended, the legend of the Flying Fortress continued to grow. Many B-17s were scrapped or sold for parts, but some were preserved as monuments to their role in securing victory. Museums and air shows around the world still display these iconic bombers, their riveted skins and cavernous bomb bays offering silent testimony to the men who flew them and the missions they endured. Visitors who step inside one of these aircraft today are often struck by how cramped and fragile they feel compared to modern planes. It's a sobering reminder of the courage it took to climb aboard one and fly straight into the heart of enemy territory. For veterans, the sight of a B-17 can stir powerful memories. Many who flew in them speak of the strange mixture of fear and pride they felt every time they took off. They remember the cold, so cold that frostbite was a constant threat. They remember the noise, a deafening roar of engines and gunfire that left many partially deaf by war's end. They remember the moments of terror, the sudden burst of flak, the scream of an attacking fighter, the sickening lurch when an engine failed. And they remember the relief and joy of seeing friendly coastline after a mission, knowing they had survived one more day. Above all, they remember the trust they placed in their flying fortress. Time and again, it brought them home when it had no right to. Time and again, it absorbed punishment that should have destroyed it. Time and again, it proved that courage, teamwork, and determination could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a symbol of resilience, of sacrifice, of the unbreakable will of those who fought for freedom. For all its steel and rivets, for all the engineering brilliance that went into its design, the heart of the B-17 story was always human. It was written in sweat and fear, in trembling hands, on cold metal controls, in friendships forged in the face of death. The Flying Fortress was a marvel of machinery, yes, but it was the men inside who gave it a soul, and who turned stories like that of the All-American into legends that would echo across generations. Imagine what it was like to be one of those men. You were barely 20, perhaps 21. Many of the bomber crew members were scarcely older than boys, fresh from training and thrown into the crucible of war. You would wake before dawn, the cold biting through your heavy flight jacket as you shuffled toward the briefing room. There, beneath a shroud of cigarette smoke and tension, you'd watch as officers unveiled the day's target on a large map. Maybe it was an aircraft factory deep in Germany, maybe a refinery in Poland, maybe a railway hub in occupied France. Wherever it was, you knew that by nightfall you might not be alive. The tension before a mission was always the worst part. Crews joked and laughed to hide their fear, but everyone felt it. Some wrote hurried letters home, just in case. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Superstition ran deep, a lucky charm tucked into a pocket, a photograph kissed before takeoff, a ritual handshake before boarding. And then the engines roared to life, a deep, chest-thumping rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath your boots. The moment you stepped onto the plane and strapped into your position, everything changed. Training took over. Fear didn't vanish, but it became background noise. The flight to the target was long and cold. Inside the unpressurized fuselage, temperatures could plummet to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen masks were essential at high altitude, and frost formed on the inside of the windows. The noise was deafening. 4 massive radial engines droning constantly, punctuated by bursts of gunfire whenever enemy fighters appeared. The smell of oil, cordite, and sweat filled the cramped compartments. Every man had a job to do, and every job mattered. The navigator pored over maps and instruments. The bombardier double-checked the bomb release mechanism. The gunners scanned the skies for the telltale glint of enemy aircraft. The pilot and co-pilot, hands stiff with cold, kept the massive bomber steady as it lumbered toward its target. Then came the flak. The Germans were masters of anti-aircraft artillery, and they lined their cities and factories with batteries of 80mm guns that could hurl explosive shells into the sky with terrifying accuracy. Black clouds of shrapnel burst all around the formation, sometimes so dense it seemed the bombers were flying through a storm. The plane shuddered with every near miss, and when a shell struck home, the sound was like the hammer of God. Holes appeared in the fuselage. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. Sometimes pieces of the aircraft simply vanished, torn away by the force of the explosion. And then there were the fighters. Fast, agile, and deadly, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swooped down in coordinated waves, their cannons shredding metal and flesh alike. Gunner positions became infernos of noise and recoil as 50-caliber machine guns spat tracers into the sky. Pilots weaved and banked to throw off enemy aim while trying desperately to keep formation, a task made harder by damage, engine failures, and wounded crew members. The chaos was unimaginable. Men screamed orders over the intercom, their voices barely audible above the roar. The bomber's heavy frame vibrated violently as it was pounded by enemy fire. And still, it flew on. Reaching the target was both a relief and a new terror. The bombardier, hunched over the Norden bomb site, called out final corrections. The bomb bay doors opened with a mechanical groan. For a brief moment, the entire crew held its breath. Then the payload was released, thousands of pounds of explosives tumbling earthward toward their target. Seconds later, the doors closed, and the formation turned for home, often the most dangerous part of the mission. Damaged bombers lagged behind, becoming easy prey for fighters. Fuel leaks meant crews had to calculate whether they'd even make it back across the channel. And those who survived knew they'd have to do it all again, tomorrow, next week, until the war was won. The emotional toll of this relentless grind was enormous. Crews lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment. They watched friends go down in flames, saw parachutes drifting helplessly toward enemy territory, heard the final words of comrades over the radio. Many suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, though at the time it was dismissed as battle fatigue. Yet despite it all, they continued to climb into those bombers mission after mission, because they believed in what they were fighting for. They believed in each other, and they believed in the aircraft that so often brought them home. For many, the bond between man and machine was deeply emotional. Pilots often described their aircraft as if they were living beings, loyal companions that responded to their touch and shared their fate. Some crews swore their planes talked to them, warning them of trouble or urging them onward. When a bomber was lost, it wasn't just metal that fell from the sky. It was a trusted friend. And when one returned against all odds, like the All-American, it was celebrated as a miracle. These bonds were not just sentimental. They were practical, too. A well-trained crew that trusted each other and their aircraft was far more likely to survive. Communication was everything. Gunners called out enemy positions and worked together to create kill zones. Navigators adjusted flight paths to avoid enemy concentrations. Pilots coordinated with other aircraft in the formation to maximize defensive firepower. Every man relied on every other, and on the flying fortress itself, to make it home. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these crews was their attitude toward death. It was always there, a constant companion, but it rarely broke them. They joked about it, defied it, and in their own way, accepted it. Many crews developed a fatalistic mindset. If their number was up, it was up. Until then, their job was to do their duty, protect their comrades, and trust their flying fortress to carry them through. That quiet acceptance, born of necessity, gave them the strength to face each new mission with courage and resolve. In the end, this human element, this unyielding will to endure, was what truly defined the B-17 story. The aircraft was a marvel of engineering, yes, its durability and design saved countless lives, but it was the men inside, with their courage, ingenuity, and refusal to surrender, who gave those stories meaning. Without them, the flying fortress was just metal. With them, it became something far greater, a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the unbreakable human spirit. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the skies that had once been filled with the roar of bombers fell silent. The B-17s, those mighty flying fortresses that had carried the fight deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, were no longer needed for daily missions of destruction. Some were flown back to the United States, others were scrapped where they stood, cut into pieces for the peacetime demand for aluminum. Yet the memory of those aircraft, and the men who had flown them, refused to fade. They had left an indelible mark not only on the outcome of the war, but on the very fabric of aviation history. The B-17 had proven that strategic bombing could change the course of a conflict. Its missions had crippled Germany's industrial capacity, destroyed critical infrastructure, and forced the diversion of enemy resources on a massive scale. More than that, the sustained bombing campaigns had forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it could not win, wearing down its experienced pilots and draining its fuel reserves. By the time Allied ground troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, German air power was a shadow of its former self, a decline made possible in large part by the relentless hammering from fleets of flying fortresses. But the B-17's influence did not end with the fall of Berlin. Its design, its operational doctrine, and even its myths shaped the future of aviation in profound ways. The lessons learned from flying long-range bombing missions over heavily defended territory informed the development of post-war bombers like the B-29 Superfortress and later the B-52 Stratofortress. Concepts such as crew coordination, formation flying, and precision targeting became cornerstones of modern air power. Even the vulnerabilities of the B-17, such as its dependence on formation defense and its lack of fighter escort in the early years, provided critical insights that shaped the evolution of air combat strategy for decades to come. In the post-war years, a handful of B-17s found new life in civilian roles. Some were converted into cargo planes or firefighting aircraft. Others were used for search and rescue operations or aerial mapping. But most were retired and scrapped, their combat days behind them. A few, however, were preserved as monuments to a generation's sacrifice. Today, these surviving aircraft are treasured pieces of history, lovingly restored and maintained by museums and aviation enthusiasts around the world. They appear at air shows, their four engines rumbling like distant thunder, giving modern audiences a visceral glimpse into a bygone era. Standing beneath one of these restored bombers is a humbling experience. The first thing most visitors notice is the size, smaller than many expect for such a legendary machine. The fuselage is cramped, the gunner positions exposed, the space for the crew barely enough to move around. It becomes immediately clear just how vulnerable these men were and how much courage it took to climb into such a machine and fly it into enemy skies. Touching the cold aluminum skin of a B-17 is like touching history itself, a tangible connection to the thousands of young men who entrusted their lives to these planes. For the veterans who flew them, those restored aircraft are more than just museum pieces. They are time machines. Each creak of the metal, each vibration of the engines brings back memories both triumphant and tragic. They remember the camaraderie, the laughter, and the small rituals that helped them face death. They remember the terror of missions that seemed impossible to survive and the relief of seeing friendly coastline after hours of flying over hostile territory. They remember friends who never came back and the empty bunks that haunted them long after the war ended. For many, those memories are bittersweet, a mixture of pride in what they accomplished and sorrow for the price that was paid. The legacy of the B-17 also extends beyond the veterans themselves. It lives on in the stories passed down to children and grandchildren, in books and films that capture the drama of the air war, and in the collective memory of a world that once hung in the balance. Movies like 12 O'Clock High and documentaries like The Cold Blue have brought the experience of the bomber crews to new generations, while countless historians and authors have chronicled the bravery and sacrifice of those who flew the flying fortress. In classrooms, museums, and memorials, the B-17 serves as a powerful teaching tool, a way to understand not just the history of World War II, but the human cost of war itself. The cultural resonance of the Flying Fortress is especially strong in the United States, where it has become a symbol of the nation's resilience and determination. Just as the Liberty Bell and the Stars and Stripes embody ideals of freedom and independence, the B-17 embodies the grit and perseverance that define the American war effort. It stands as a reminder that victory was not inevitable, that it was earned through courage, sacrifice, and relentless effort. The image of a battered B-17 limping home with smoke trailing from its engines, its crew battered but alive, is more than just a war story. It's a metaphor for endurance itself. Even in the modern age of stealth bombers and precision-guided munitions, the spirit of the Flying Fortress endures. Pilots and aircrew in today's air forces still study the tactics and lessons of the B-17 era. Military historians still debate the effectiveness of strategic bombing, but few dispute the courage of the men who carried it out. And aviation enthusiasts continue to restore and fly the few remaining B-17s, ensuring that their thunderous engines will never be silenced completely. There is something almost poetic about watching one of these giants take to the sky today. As it lifts off, its four engines roaring, you can imagine what it must have been like in 1943. Hundreds of them rising together, bound for enemy skies. You can imagine the fear in the hearts of the young men aboard and the steely determination that kept them at their posts. You can imagine the desperate prayers of families back home, waiting for news that their sons had returned. In that moment, the past and present blur, and the legend of the Flying Fortress feels as alive as ever. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. The B-17 is not merely a relic of a bygone war. It is a story, one written in courage and sacrifice, in smoke-filled skies and frozen cockpits, in friendships forged amid fire. It is a story about the limits of human endurance and the strength found in unity. And above all, it is a story about hope. The hope that even in the darkest of times, we can rise above fear, defy the odds, and make it home. As the decades passed, the B-17 and its crews gradually shifted from living memory into legend. Veterans grew older, reunions became smaller, and those who had once flown into the heart of enemy territory now shared their stories with grandchildren instead of fellow airmen. And yet, even as the living connection to that era faded, the legend of the Flying Fortress only grew stronger. It wasn't just about metal and engines anymore. It was about what the plane represented, the courage of youth, the resilience of a nation, and the timeless human drive to overcome the impossible. One of the most remarkable aspects of the B-17 story is how deeply it continues to resonate with people who were born long after the war ended. To this day, when a restored Flying Fortress makes a rare appearance at an air show, crowds gather in silent awe. Children cover their ears against the thunder of the engines. Veterans stand with tears in their eyes, lost in memories. And younger generations, who know war only from textbooks and documentaries, feel a sudden, visceral connection to history. It's one thing to read about the courage of bomber crews. It's another entirely to stand beneath the shadow of a machine that carried them into battle. Part of the B-17's enduring power lies in the stories that surround it. Tales like that of the All-American or WOULDN pub don't just capture the imagination. They speak to something universal. They remind us that even in our darkest moments, hope can survive. They show us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. They prove that teamwork, trust, and determination can achieve the impossible. These lessons are as relevant today as they were in 1943, whether on a battlefield, in a boardroom, or in the struggles of everyday life. The B-17 also stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of war. For all the heroism and glory, the bomber campaigns were brutal and unforgiving. Tens of thousands of young men never returned from their missions. Many who did were changed forever, carrying the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. Families received telegrams that shattered their worlds. Entire communities felt the weight of absence. These losses are part of the B-17 story too, and they lend even greater weight to the triumphs. Every bomber that limped home on 3 engines, every crew that survived against the odds, every mission that made it back when it shouldn't have. Each one was a victory paid for in blood and sacrifice. Perhaps that's why the image of a battered flying fortress returning home remains so deeply moving. It is a symbol not just of survival, but of endurance in the face of overwhelming adversity. The plane that refused to die mirrors the people who built it, flew it, and believed in it. It mirrors the spirit of a generation that faced down tyranny and refused to surrender. And in that way, the B-17 is not just a piece of history, it is a reflection of humanity's greatest strengths. Today, many of those strengths are still on display in the people who dedicate their lives to preserving these aircraft. Restoring a B-17 is no small task. It takes years of painstaking work, countless hours of labor, and millions of dollars in funding. But for those who undertake it, the effort is more than worth it. Each rivet replaced, each engine rebuilt, each faded panel polished back to life is a tribute to the men who once climbed aboard these planes and never looked back. And when the work is done, when the engines roar to life and the bomber lifts into the sky once more, it's as if the past itself has come alive again. For many veterans and their families, these restored aircraft serve as flying memorials. They are places to remember lost friends and loved ones, to honor sacrifices that must never be forgotten. At air shows and commemorative events, it's not uncommon to see veterans quietly lay a hand on the fuselage of a B-17, whispering a few words to those who didn't make it back. These moments are deeply personal, but they are also profoundly universal. They remind us that history is not just dates and battles. It's people. It's stories. It's lives lived and lives lost. The B-17's influence can even be felt in the way we think about resilience today. Its story is often invoked in speeches, books, and even popular culture as a metaphor for perseverance. Businesses speak of flying fortress moments when describing teams that overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Educators use its missions as case studies in leadership and teamwork. Even in space exploration, engineers have drawn comparisons between the redundancy and durability of the B-17 and the design of spacecraft meant to survive the harsh conditions of space. In a sense, the spirit of the flying fortress has transcended its origins. It has become a symbol of human ingenuity and determination in all its forms. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the B-17 is the bond it created among those who flew it. Even decades later, veterans who served on the same crew speak of their shared experiences with a closeness that time cannot diminish. They remember the long hours in the cold, the moments of sheer terror, the laughter in the face of danger. They remember how every mission depended on trust in the man next to you, trust in the crew as a whole, and trust in the machine that carried you. These bonds were forged in fire, and they lasted a lifetime. As one veteran put it years later, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We were just kids doing a job. But we believed in each other, and we believed in that airplane. It never let us down." That sentiment, humble, resolute, and deeply human, captures the essence of the B-17 story better than any statistic or technical detail ever could. In the end, the story of the B-17 is not about warplanes or weaponry. It's not even just about victory in a global conflict. It's about people, young men who faced unimaginable odds and refused to give up. It's about the power of courage, teamwork, and perseverance. And it's about the enduring belief that even when everything seems lost, there is always a way home. The Flying Fortress embodied all of those things, and that is why, more than 80 years after it first took to the skies, it still captures our imagination. If there's one image that captures the essence of the B-17 and everything it stood for, it is this: a crippled flying fortress limping home through hostile skies, its engines coughing smoke, its fuselage riddled with holes, its crew battered but alive. It is a vision of defiance, of a machine that refuses to surrender, of men who refuse to quit, and of a mission that must be completed no matter the cost. It is the embodiment of a truth that transcends war, that the human spirit is at its strongest when faced with overwhelming odds. This defiance was not born of arrogance, nor was it fueled by blind aggression. It was rooted in something deeper, a profound sense of duty. For the men of the 8th Air Force, the 15th Air Force, and the other Bomber groups that flew B-17s, every mission was more than just a military operation. It was a contribution to something far larger than themselves. They were not merely dropping bombs on enemy factories. They were helping to shorten a brutal war, to liberate occupied nations, to bring an end to tyranny. Every mile they flew brought that goal a little closer. Every bomb they dropped weakened the enemy's ability to fight, and every safe return was a small victory in a vast and terrible struggle. This sense of purpose was often what kept crews going when everything else seemed hopeless. It was what pushed them to hold the controls steady as flak ripped holes in their wings. It was what gave them the strength to drag wounded comrades back to safety. It was what allowed them to stare death in the face, mission after mission, and climb back into the sky. And it was what turned the B-17 from a mere aircraft into a symbol of resistance, not just against Nazi Germany, but against despair itself. Yet, even with this larger purpose, the war was deeply personal for those who fought it. Each crewman carried with him the weight of home, the letters tucked into flight jackets, the photographs taped to cockpit walls, the promises made to loved ones before boarding the plane. In quiet moments between missions, they spoke not of strategy or politics, but of farms and towns and futures waiting beyond the war. It was these personal stakes, the hope of returning home, of building a life after the guns fell silent, that infused their courage with meaning. And it was that same hope that made every successful landing, every miraculous return, feel like a small miracle. One of the most remarkable things about the B-17 story is how often those miracles occurred. Again and again, aircraft that should never have flown another mile made it back across the Channel or the Mediterranean. Again and again, crews who should have perished walked away from crash landings with little more than bruises and shock. It was as if the flying fortress itself shared their will to survive, as if, like its crew, it simply refused to die. Even enemy pilots marveled at the bomber's tenacity. German ace Adolf Galland once remarked, "The B-17 was a tough opponent. You could shoot it to pieces, and still it would keep flying." This toughness became a key part of the aircraft's mythos, a quality that set it apart from anything else in the sky. It wasn't the fastest bomber of the war. It didn't carry the heaviest bomb load. But it had a spirit, a stubborn, unyielding resilience that made it legendary. And that spirit was contagious. Crews drew strength from their aircraft, just as their aircraft seemed to draw strength from them. Together, man and machine formed a partnership that was far greater than the sum of its parts. The bond between crew and aircraft extended beyond the battlefield, too. Many veterans spoke of their B-17s with deep affection long after the war ended. Some kept pieces of their planes, a control yoke, a patch of fuselage, a fragment of glass from the nose, as treasured mementos. Others gave talks at schools and museums, sharing stories of the planes that had saved their lives. And some even returned to restored flying fortresses decades later, their hands trembling as they touched the cold metal once more, their eyes misting as memories flooded back. For those who never made it home, the B-17 serves as a memorial. The names of thousands of bomber crewmen are etched into monuments around the world. In England, in Italy, in the United States. Many of their remains lie in foreign soil, far from the towns and cities they left behind. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Their courage helped bring about the defeat of one of the most brutal regimes in human history. Their missions hastened the liberation of millions, and their stories continue to inspire new generations to stand firm in the face of adversity. It's worth remembering, too, that the B-17 story is not just an American one. Crews from Britain, Canada, Australia, Poland, and other allied nations flew alongside American airmen, sharing the same dangers and the same determination. Their combined efforts forged bonds that transcended borders, bonds that endure to this day. The skies over Europe became a place where nations united in common cause, where young men from different continents fought and died side by side. And in that crucible of fire and steel, they forged a legacy of unity that remains one of the most enduring aspects of the Second World War. Even now, more than 80 years after the first B-17 rolled off the production line, that legacy continues to shape our world. It lives on in the veterans who share their stories with schoolchildren, in the historians who keep the record alive, and in the pilots who coax restored bombers into the air at commemorative events. It lives on in the engineers and aviation enthusiasts who dedicate their lives to preserving these aircraft for future generations. And it lives on in the countless people who, upon hearing the deep, throaty rumble of a B-17's engines overhead, look up and feel a surge of pride and gratitude. There is a lesson in all of this, one that goes far beyond the history of a single airplane. The story of the B-17 is, at its core, a story about perseverance. It's about the refusal to give up, even when the odds are overwhelming. It's about the strength that comes from unity, the resilience born of shared purpose, and the miracles that can happen when ordinary people rise to meet extraordinary challenges. These lessons are as relevant today as they were in the skies over Europe in 1943. They remind us that no matter how dark the night, there is always a path forward. No matter how heavy the burden, there is always a way through. And no matter how desperate the situation, hope, like a battered flying fortress, can endure. When we look back at the great machines of war, many of them fade into history as footnotes, technical achievements, statistics, or relics of a bygone age. But the B-17 is different. It transcends the numbers. It's not remembered simply because it dropped thousands of tons of bombs or flew tens of thousands of sorties. It's remembered because of what it represented and what it revealed about the people who built it, flew it, and trusted it with their lives. It is remembered because, in so many ways, it was more than an aircraft. It was a vessel of human spirit. For the young men who climbed into its belly, the B-17 was both cradle and coffin. It was a place where they laughed, where they fought, where they prayed. It was the stage for their greatest fears and their greatest triumphs. It was a steel guardian that shielded them from the cold, from the gunfire, from the void below. It was also, in its most fragile moments, a reflection of their own mortality, a reminder that no amount of armor or firepower could guarantee a safe return. Yet, paradoxically, it was that very fragility that made their courage so extraordinary. Every time they strapped themselves into that aircraft and lifted off the runway, they did so knowing the risks, and they did it anyway. The B-17 also taught profound lessons about the nature of teamwork. A bomber was only as strong as the crew that manned it. 10 men, each with a vital job, had to function as one unit, a living, breathing organism in the sky. The pilot depended on the navigator to guide them through enemy territory. The bombardier depended on the pilot to line up the target. The gunners depended on one another to create overlapping fields of fire. And they all depended on the radio operator to keep them connected to the outside world. If even one man faltered, the entire mission could fail. But when they worked together, when trust was absolute and coordination seamless, they could achieve miracles. That lesson in unity is as relevant today as it was then, whether in the cockpit of a bomber or in any endeavor that demands collective effort. There's another lesson, too, one that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. The B-17 story is filled with moments where logic says the plane should have fallen, where physics says it shouldn't have flown, where common sense says no one should have survived. And yet, again and again, they did. The All-American limped home with its tail hanging by a thread. Ye Olde Pub flew back to England with holes so large you could see daylight through the fuselage. Bombers returned with dead engines, shredded wings, blown-out noses, even missing landing gear, and still they made it back. These weren't just mechanical miracles. They were triumphs of willpower, ingenuity, and refusal to give up. They were living proof that sometimes survival isn't about strength or speed. It's about stubbornness. Even the enemy recognized this. In the post-war years, many German pilots admitted a grudging respect for the Flying Fortress and its crews. They described them as relentless, determined, and impossibly brave. They spoke of bombers that simply wouldn't go down, no matter how many rounds they poured into them. They recalled formations that pressed on toward their targets even as aircraft exploded around them. And they remembered crews who fought to the last, defending their comrades with unwavering resolve. This respect, coming from men who had tried their hardest to destroy them, speaks volumes about the character of those who flew the B-17. It's important to remember that this character was not born in extraordinary people. Most bomber crewmen were ordinary young men from ordinary towns, farmers, factory workers, students, clerks. They weren't superheroes or larger-than-life figures. They were people who answered a call, learned their craft, and did their duty with quiet determination. And in that ordinariness lies the true power of their story. Because if ordinary people could endure such extraordinary challenges, then perhaps we all carry that same strength within us. The strength to persevere, to protect, to rise above fear. Today, that lesson is more valuable than ever. We live in a world that, while far removed from the firestorms of the 1940s, still faces its share of challenges. Challenges that require courage, cooperation, and resilience. And in those moments, the story of the Flying Fortress still has something to teach us. It teaches us that even when everything seems hopeless, we are capable of more than we think. It teaches us that unity is our greatest weapon against adversity. And it teaches us that no matter how badly we are battered, we can still find a way forward. When you stand beneath a B-17 today, when you run your hand along its cold metal skin, peer through its gunner positions, or climb into its cramped cockpit, you're not just looking at a piece of history. You're standing in the presence of a story of young men who risked everything for something greater than themselves, a story of machines that defied the laws of physics and probability, a story of hope, sacrifice, and resilience, and most of all, a story of a spirit that refused to die. That spirit is why the B-17 remains one of the most beloved aircraft in history. It's why museums dedicate entire exhibits to its legacy. It's why aviation enthusiasts spend years restoring them to flight. And it's why, every time one takes to the sky, crowds look up in awe. Because when we see a flying fortress soaring overhead, we're reminded not just of what happened 8 decades ago, but of what's possible when determination meets courage. We're reminded that no matter how many holes are torn through us, no matter how many engines fail, no matter how hopeless the situation seems, we too can keep flying. It is this timeless relevance, this bridge between past and present, that ensures the B-17 will never truly be forgotten. Long after the last veteran has told his story, long after the final flying fortress has made its last flight, the lessons it taught us will endure. They will live on in the way we face adversity, in the way we support one another, and in the way we refuse to give up. They will live on every time someone chooses to keep going when everything seems lost. And they will live on every time we look at the sky and remember those who once did the same. The story of the B-17 is, in many ways, the story of World War II itself, a story of overwhelming challenges, devastating losses, and hard-won triumphs. It's a story about humanity at its worst and its best, about destruction on an unimaginable scale and the courage it takes to stand against it. And like the war it helped to win, the legacy of the Flying Fortress is not one of violence, but of endurance. It is a story about what it means to hold the line, to keep pushing forward, even when the cost is almost too great to bear. That legacy is written in the history books, yes, but it is also written in the quiet moments, in the weathered hands of a veteran who still remembers the feel of the control yoke, in the faded photographs tucked into scrapbooks, in the rusted dog tags found in fields where bombers once fell. It's written in the stories told around dinner tables, in the lessons passed from one generation to the next, and it's written in the skies themselves every time a restored B-17 takes flight and the world looks up once more. The legacy is also written in the lessons that shaped the post-war world. The strategic bombing campaigns, though controversial and costly, played a significant role in the Allied victory. They forced Germany to divert resources from the front lines to defend its cities and factories. They crippled production and shattered supply lines, and they demonstrated the power and the limitations of air power in modern warfare. These lessons influenced not only the design of future aircraft, but also the strategies of future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. But beyond tactics and technology, the B-17 left behind something far more important: a legacy of unity. The bomber crews who flew into enemy skies came from every corner of America, from cities and farms, from the East Coast to the West, from every walk of life. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. They were volunteers and draftees, college students, and factory workers. They were as diverse as the nation they served. And yet, in the cramped, freezing confines of a flying fortress, they became a single unit, bound together by trust, duty, and a shared sense of purpose. That unity, that ability to set aside differences and work toward a common goal, is perhaps the most enduring lesson of all. It's also a lesson that resonates deeply in our own time. In a world often divided by politics, geography, and ideology, the story of the B-17 reminds us of what we can accomplish when we stand together. It shows us that when we trust one another, support one another, and fight for something larger than ourselves, there is no challenge too great to overcome. It shows us that resilience is not just a quality of machines or armies, it's a quality of people. And it shows us that even in our darkest hours, hope can carry us through. There's a reason that historians, filmmakers, and storytellers keep returning to the B-17. There's a reason that museums dedicate so much time and effort to preserving them, and why crowds still gather to see them fly. It's because the Flying Fortress is more than a piece of history. It's a symbol of bravery, of sacrifice, of the human capacity to endure. It's a reminder of where we've been and what we're capable of. And it's a call to remember the cost of the freedoms we enjoy today. Perhaps most importantly, the B-17 reminds us that history is made not by the extraordinary, but by ordinary people who rise to extraordinary challenges. The men who flew these bombers were not so different from us. They had hopes, fears, dreams, and doubts. They worried about their futures and missed their families. They made mistakes, got scared, and sometimes wondered if they would survive. But when the time came, they did what needed to be done, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. Their courage also changed the way we see ourselves. It showed us that strength is not about invulnerability, it's about persistence. It showed us that heroism is not about fearlessness, it's about facing fear and acting anyway. And it showed us that victory is not about never falling, it's about getting back up again and again, no matter how many times you're knocked down. Those are lessons that go far beyond war. They are lessons we can carry into every part of our lives, in every challenge we face. The Flying Fortress, in all its rugged beauty and brutal efficiency, is a testament to those truths. Every rivet, every gun turret, every scar in its weathered metal tells a story. Some of those stories end in tragedy, others end in triumph. All of them end in courage, and together they form a legacy that continues to inspire people around the world, not just as a relic of the past, but as a guide for the future. Imagine standing on an airfield today as a restored B-17 taxis down the runway. Its engines rumble, its propellers blur, and with a surge of power, it lifts off into the sky. For a brief moment, time seems to fold in on itself. The decades melt away, and you can almost see the ghosts of history rising with it. The young men who once flew missions over Europe, the ground crews who kept the planes flying, the families who waited anxiously for their return. You can almost hear their laughter, their shouts, their prayers, and you realize that they are not gone. They live on in the roar of those engines, in the gleam of the polished aluminum, in the stories we continue to tell. That's the true magic of the B-17. It doesn't just remind us of the past, it brings the past to life. It makes us feel it, hear it, and understand it in a way that no textbook ever could. And in doing so, it keeps alive the memory of those who gave so much, so that we might have the world we live in today. There's a quiet dignity in the way a B-17 rests on the ground. It doesn't boast or roar, it doesn't need to. Its presence alone tells a story of men who defied impossible odds, of missions that shaped the course of history, and of a time when the fate of the world was decided in the frozen skies above Europe. To stand beside one today is to stand beside history itself, to feel the weight of all the stories it carries in its riveted skin and scarred aluminum bones. It is both a monument and a messenger, a machine that speaks not through words but through the echoes of everything it has seen. For those who flew it, the Flying Fortress was more than a weapon. It was home. Home in the middle of hostile skies. Home 30,000 feet above the earth. Home when there was no guarantee they would ever see their real homes again. Within its narrow fuselage and cramped gun positions, friendships were forged that lasted a lifetime. Bonds formed in those conditions, under fire, amid fear and chaos, were unbreakable. Men who might never have met in peacetime became brothers in the air, their fates intertwined, their survival dependent on one another. And even decades later, many of those bonds remained, their reunions filled with tears, laughter, and a deep understanding that only those who had lived through it could ever share. It's easy to see the B-17 as a symbol of destruction. After all, it was built to drop bombs, and it did so with devastating effect. But look a little deeper, and you'll see something else. You'll see a machine that protected the values its crews believed in. You'll see a weapon that helped bring down tyranny and free millions from oppression. And you'll see a vessel that carried not just bombs, but hope. Hope that one day the world could be free of fascism. Hope that the sacrifices being made were not in vain, hope that the skies they fought for would one day be skies of peace, and that hope was not misplaced. The missions flown by B-17 crews played a pivotal role in breaking the back of Nazi Germany. Their relentless assaults on industrial centers, transportation networks, and fuel supplies crippled the German war machine. Their ability to reach deep into enemy territory forced the Luftwaffe into a costly battle of attrition it could not sustain, and their unwavering determination to complete their missions, no matter the odds, helped pave the way for the liberation of Europe. Without the flying fortress and the men who flew it, the war might have dragged on far longer, and its outcome might have been far less certain. Today, the legacy of those missions lives on, not just in the history books, but in the freedom we often take for granted. The world we inhabit, a world built on democracy, cooperation, and shared humanity, owes much to the sacrifices made by those bomber crews. Every time we vote, speak freely, or live without fear of tyranny, we are honoring their memory. Every time we stand up for what is right in the face of adversity, we are continuing the fight they began. And every time we look to the sky and see a B-17 soaring above us, we are reminded that freedom is never free. It is earned, often at a terrible cost. There's a powerful lesson in the way those crews faced their missions. They knew the odds. They knew how many planes had failed to return. They knew that every sortie could be their last. And still, they went. They climbed into their aircraft, buckled their harnesses, and took to the skies because they believed that what they were doing mattered. That kind of courage, the courage to act despite fear, to endure despite pain, to fight despite uncertainty, is rare and precious. It is the kind of courage that changes the world. We see echoes of that courage today in people who stand up for what is right even when it's difficult, who work together to solve problems that seem insurmountable, who refuse to give up even when the odds are against them. The story of the B-17 is not confined to history. It is a living lesson, a blueprint for resilience in every field of human endeavor. It reminds us that when we unite behind a purpose larger than ourselves, there is nothing we cannot achieve. And that's why the B-17 still captures our imagination more than 8 decades after it first took flight. It's why filmmakers still tell its stories, why historians still study its missions, why aviation enthusiasts still restore and fly its remaining airframes. It's why people who have never set foot in a cockpit still feel a lump in their throat when they hear the deep, rhythmic drone of its engines. Because deep down, we all understand what the Flying Fortress represents. It represents the best of us, our courage, our determination, our capacity to endure. One cannot help but wonder what the crews of those bombers would think if they could see the world today. Would they believe that their sacrifices had meaning? Would they feel that what they fought for was worth the cost? The answer, surely, is yes. For while the world is far from perfect, it is a far better place because of what they did. Their courage toppled dictatorships. Their sacrifice ended genocides. Their determination built a foundation for peace. And their legacy continues to inspire people everywhere to stand up for justice, to protect freedom, and to believe in the possibility of a better tomorrow. The story of the B-17 is a story of war, yes. But more than that, it is a story of humanity, of people rising to meet the greatest challenge of their lives and emerging stronger for it. It is a story of machines built for destruction that became symbols of hope. It is a story of lives lost and lives saved, of dreams deferred and dreams fulfilled. It is a story of how, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can soar. And perhaps that is why, long after the last Flying Fortress has made its final flight, its story will continue to be told. Because the lessons it teaches are timeless. They are lessons about courage and sacrifice, about teamwork and resilience, about the power of hope and the necessity of perseverance. They are lessons that every generation must learn anew. And as long as those lessons remain relevant, as long as we need reminders of what we are capable of when we stand together, the legend of the B-17 will live on. There's a moment when you stand before a B-17 in a museum or at an air show that silence falls over you. It's not just the size or the shape that commands your respect, though the plane's broad wings and hulking fuselage are impressive enough. It's the realization of what it represents. You can almost see the ghosts of the past moving through its narrow interior, the young pilot gripping the controls, the bombardier crouched over the bomb site, the gunners bracing themselves as fighters close in. You can almost hear the radio chatter, the rattle of machine guns, the rising pitch of the engines as the plane claws for altitude. It's as if the aircraft itself is alive with memory, whispering stories to those who are willing to listen. And those stories, those very human, very real stories, are the beating heart of the B-17's legacy. They're stories of courage under fire, of sacrifice without hesitation, of duty carried out in the face of unimaginable danger. They're stories of men like Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, who kept his shattered bomber aloft with just 2 engines and a prayer. Of Staff Sergeant Albert Chapman, who stayed at his gun despite being gravely wounded, saving his crew from a deadly fighter attack. Of crews who refused to bail out even as flames licked at their wings, determined to bring their brothers home. These are the stories that give the Flying Fortress its soul, stories of ordinary people performing extraordinary deeds. They're also stories of humanity in the midst of horror. The tale of WOULDN pub and the German fighter ace Franz Stigler is perhaps the most famous example. After a brutal bombing mission over Germany, WOULDN pub was left crippled, engines failing, fuselage torn apart, crew wounded and dying. Stigler, flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109, could have easily finished the job and sent the American bomber crashing to the ground. Instead, moved by the sight of the helpless aircraft and its suffering crew, he chose a different path. He escorted the B-17 out of German airspace, saluted the crew, and turned back home, a moment of shared humanity that transcended the hatred and chaos of war. Decades later, the surviving crew and Stigler reunited as friends. Their story is a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion can still find a way. Moments like that remind us that the B-17's story is not just one of war, it is one of connection. It's about the bonds between crew members, forged in fire and fear. It's about the shared respect between enemies who recognized each other's courage. And it's about the enduring link between past and present, between the generations who fought and the generations who remember. When we honor the B-17 and its crews, we are not glorifying war. We are honoring the human qualities that shone brightest amid its darkness: bravery, loyalty, sacrifice, and empathy. These qualities are what make the story of the Flying Fortress timeless. They are the same qualities we admire today in firefighters rushing into burning buildings, in doctors battling deadly diseases, in activists standing up for justice against overwhelming odds. The context may change, but the essence is the same. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the sake of others. And that is why the B-17 still resonates, because it speaks to something deep within us, something universal and enduring. The aircraft itself is also a testament to the power of ingenuity and determination. The engineers and workers who designed and built the B-17 did so under immense pressure, racing against time to create an aircraft that could meet the demands of a global war. They worked around the clock in factories across America, often unaware of how crucial their work would become. For them, the B-17 was not just a machine, it was a promise to the men who would fly it, a promise to the nations who depended on it, a promise that no matter how hard the road ahead, they would have the tools they needed to fight and to win. And win they did. The Flying Fortress was never invincible. Thousands were shot down, and thousands of airmen were lost. But its impact on the war was undeniable. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility, broke the back of German industry, and helped pave the way for liberation. And even in defeat, even when bombers didn't make it home, their sacrifice had meaning. Each mission, successful or not, brought the Allies one step closer to victory. Each life lost was part of a larger story, a story of a world united against tyranny, determined to defend freedom at any cost. Today, when we see a B-17 in flight, it's easy to romanticize the past, to see only the heroism and not the horror. But we must remember both. We must remember the courage, yes, but also the fear, the triumphs, but also the tragedies, the victories, but also the empty seats in the mess halls, the telegrams delivered to grieving families, the lives that ended far too soon. Because it is in remembering all of it, the light and the darkness, that we truly honor the legacy of those who served. And that legacy is not confined to the history books. It lives on in every act of resilience, every moment of unity, every refusal to surrender in the face of adversity. It lives on in the way we remember the past and in the way we strive to build a better future. It lives on every time someone stands up for what's right, every time a community comes together to overcome a challenge, every time a person refuses to give up even when the odds seem impossible. That is the legacy of the B-17. That is the spirit of the Flying Fortress. And so, when we ask how a plane so riddled with damage managed to bring its crew home, the answer is more than mechanical. Yes, it was the strength of the design, the redundancy of its systems, the skill of its engineers. But more than that, it was the will of the people who flew it. It was the bond between brothers who refused to leave one another behind. It was the courage of pilots who refused to let go of the controls. It was the determination of crews who refused to give up hope. It was the spirit, the indomitable, unbreakable spirit, of those who believed that no matter how bad things got, they would find a way home. The question at the heart of this story, how did a plane so riddled with damage manage to bring its crew home, is one with many answers. On the surface, it's a question of engineering. The B-17 was built to withstand unimaginable punishment with redundant systems, reinforced structures, and an over-engineered frame that could absorb damage and still keep flying. Its 4 engines meant that even if 1 or 2 failed, the aircraft could limp home. Its rugged construction meant that holes torn through the fuselage or shredded control surfaces didn't always spell disaster. Its ability to stay in the air with fuel leaking, hydraulics gone, and half its body missing was nothing short of miraculous. But if we stop there, if we reduce the story to rivets, bolts, and aerodynamics, we miss the deeper truth. Because the real reason those bombers made it home was not just their design. It was the human beings inside them. The B-17 could absorb damage, yes, but it was the skill and willpower of the crews that brought it back. It was the pilot fighting a failing yoke, the co-pilot managing fuel flow by hand, the navigator recalculating a course without instruments, the gunners patching holes with whatever they could find. It was the wounded radio operator refusing to pass out before sending one last transmission. It was the crew as a single living organism, each man doing everything he could to keep that machine, and each other, alive. There's a powerful metaphor in that. The B-17 was tough, but its toughness meant nothing without the people who flew it. And those people were strong, but their strength was magnified by the machine they trusted. Together they formed something greater, a partnership between human and machine, will and steel, courage and engineering. It was this partnership that made the impossible possible. It was this partnership that allowed so many damaged bombers to limp home when, by every law of physics, they should have fallen from the sky. This partnership also reflects something larger, something timeless about the human experience. Throughout history, our greatest achievements have always been the result of collaboration between people and technology, between leaders and those they lead, between individuals united by a common cause. The B-17 was a shining example of that truth. It was a machine built by thousands of workers, maintained by dedicated ground crews, and flown by crews who trusted one another with their lives. It was a collective triumph, and that perhaps is why its legacy endures. It reminds us that when we come together, when we bring our skills, our courage, and our determination to bear, there is very little we cannot overcome. It also reminds us of the cost of that triumph. Every B-17 that made it home told a story of survival, but every one that didn't told a story of sacrifice. More than 4,700 B-17s were lost in combat during World War II, and with them tens of thousands of young lives. Some were shot down in flames, their crews never found. Others crash-landed behind enemy lines, their survivors spending the rest of the war in prison camps. Some vanished without a trace, their fates unknown even decades later. For every miraculous return, there was a tragedy, and those tragedies must never be forgotten. They are part of the same story, part of the same legacy. This duality, triumph and tragedy, survival and sacrifice, is what gives the B-17 story its depth and power. It is not a story of unbroken success or invulnerability. It is a story of perseverance in the face of unimaginable hardship. It is a story of ordinary people doing their best in extraordinary circumstances. It is a story of loss and hope, despair and resilience, fear and courage, all woven together into the fabric of one of the most defining chapters in human history. And that is why the legend of the Flying Fortress continues to inspire us today. Because it is not just a story about war, it is a story about life itself. Life, too, is often a battle against overwhelming odds. We all face moments when it feels like we're flying with one engine out, when our wings are full of holes, when we're barely holding together. We all face storms we didn't see coming, losses that tear pieces out of us, challenges that leave us wondering if we can keep going. And yet, like the crews of those battered B-17s, we find a way. We hold on. We keep flying. In that sense, the Flying Fortress is more than a machine. It is a metaphor. It's a reminder that resilience is not about being unbreakable. It's about continuing to move forward even when you are broken. It's about patching the holes, nursing the engines, and steering toward home even when the odds are against you. It's about refusing to give up no matter how bad the damage is. And it's about trusting the people beside you, because none of us can make it home alone. The men who flew the B-17 understood that. They understood that every mission was a team effort, that survival depended on every crew member doing his part. And they understood that the machine they flew was not just a collection of parts, it was a lifeline, a partner, a home. That understanding forged a bond that transcended the battlefield. Many crews described their bombers almost as living beings, companions that had shared their struggles and saved their lives. And when those bombers were lost, the grief was real. It was like losing a friend. That bond, that shared struggle, and that relentless will to survive. That's the heart of this story. And it's why, even now, more than 80 years after the B-17 first took to the skies, its legend continues to grow. Because the Flying Fortress is more than a plane that refused to die. It's a symbol of a generation that refused to surrender. It's a testament to the power of unity, courage, and determination. And it's a reminder that no matter how damaged we are, we can always find a way home, if we refuse to give up. So when we think of those battered bombers limping across the sky, smoke trailing from their engines, fuselages torn open, wings riddled with holes, when we think of the crews inside, exhausted but resolute, clinging to hope with every breath, we are not just remembering history. We are remembering a truth that still matters today, a truth that says resilience is stronger than destruction, that says courage is stronger than fear, that says the human spirit, once awakened, is almost impossible to kill. In the end, the B-17 Flying Fortress was never just about metal and mechanics. It was never only about bombs or battles, victories or losses. It was about people, young, scared, determined people who were asked to do the impossible and did it anyway. It was about the power of human will, the strength of teamwork, and the unbreakable bond between man and machine. It was about a generation that faced the darkness head-on and refused to let it win. And it was about the moments, small and immense, when courage changed the course of history. It is tempting, all these decades later, to see the B-17 as part of a distant past, a relic from a black-and-white world that has little to do with us now. But look closer, and you'll see that its story is not about the past at all. It's about who we are and who we can be. It's about what we are capable of when we work together, when we believe in something bigger than ourselves, when we refuse to accept defeat. It's about how far we can go when we trust each other, when we fight for each other, when we never stop pushing forward, even when everything around us is falling apart. The battered bombers that clawed their way back from missions they were never supposed to survive are metaphors for all of us, because life, like war, is rarely easy. We will all face days when we feel shot full of holes, when our engines are failing, when the storms around us seem too powerful to escape. We will all have moments when we wonder if we can keep flying, and in those moments, the story of the B-17 reminds us that we can, that we must, that we are capable of more than we think. It reminds us that resilience is not about strength that never falters. It's about strength that refuses to break. It reminds us that victory is not about never falling. It's about rising again and again, no matter how many times we're knocked down. It reminds us that hope is not the absence of fear. It's the belief that something better lies ahead, even when the path is shrouded in smoke and fire. These are the lessons the Flying Fortress teaches us. These are the truths that lie at the heart of its story. And perhaps the greatest truth of all is this: the B-17 never brought its crews home on its own. They brought each other home. A pilot and co-pilot, navigator and bombardier, gunners and radio operators. Each man depended on the others. Each man fought for the others. And together, They made it. They turned what should have been tragedies into triumphs, disasters into miracles. They transformed a machine into a lifeline, a weapon into a symbol. And that, more than anything, is the legacy they left behind. Today the skies are quiet. The great bomber fleets that once darkened the heavens are gone. But the spirit of the Flying Fortress lives on, in the museums that preserve it, in the air shows that keep its engines roaring, and in the hearts of those who remember. It lives on in the stories we tell and the lessons we carry forward. And it lives on every time we face adversity with courage, every time we stand together in the face of overwhelming odds, every time we refuse to give up. When you see a B-17 today, maybe gleaming under the sun at an airfield, maybe sitting silent and proud in a museum hangar, take a moment to listen. Listen to the echoes of its engines, the whispers of the men who flew it, the heartbeat of history that still pulses within its frame. It is telling you something important. It is reminding you that no matter how battered you are, no matter how hopeless things seem, no matter how close you are to falling apart, you can keep flying. You can make it home. Because that is the real meaning of the B-17 that refused to die. It's not just a story about a plane, it's a story about us, about the strength we find in one another, about the power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit, about the unyielding truth that even when the odds are impossible and the sky is full of fire, we can still find our way back. So remember the Flying Fortress. Remember the men who flew her. Remember the missions that seemed doomed but ended in victory. And remember that somewhere inside each of us, there is a piece of that same indomitable spirit, the spirit that refuses to quit, refuses to break, refuses to die. And in that spirit, in that determination to endure, we carry the legacy of the B-17 forward, not just as history, but as inspiration. It is a reminder that even the most battered, broken thing can still soar, that even when the world tries to bring us down, we can still rise, and that even when the darkness closes in, there is always, always a way home. Because in the end, it wasn't just steel and rivets that brought those crews back. It wasn't just engines or aerodynamics or luck. It was something far stronger, something no enemy could shoot down, no flak could destroy, no storm could break. It was the spirit of the men who flew her, and that spirit will never die.